I'm David Levine. My co-chair is Joe Bonner, who's behind the scenes, and he's running this broadcast, and we'll put it on YouTube. My guest tonight is Dr. Daniel Lee Lieberman. He's the author of Exercised, Why Something We Never Evolved to Do is Healthy and Rewarding. Dr. Lieberman is the Edwin M. Lerner Professor of Biological Sciences and Professor in the Department of Human Evolutionary Biology at Harvard University. He received degrees from Harvard and Cambridge and taught at Rutgers University and George Washington University before joining Harvard as a professor. Dr. Lieberman studies and teaches how and why the human body is the way it is and how our evolutionary history affects health and disease. In this research, he combines experimental biomechanics, anatomy, and physiology, both in the lab and in the field, primarily Kenya and Mexico. He is best known for his work on the evolution of running and other kinds of physical activities, such as walking and throwing. He's also well known for studying the evolution of the human head. He's written several other books, including The Evolution of the Human Head, The Story of the Human Body, Evolution, Health, and Disease. In his spare time, he enjoys running, sometimes barefoot, and he is nicknamed the Barefoot Professor. So thank you for joining us tonight. We appreciate it very much.
My pleasure.
So why don't you show a copy of your book?
Oh, gosh.
Okay. Because in the old days when I did this in person, we would sell, okay, thank you. We would actually have the author sign the books. We can't really do that now. So I wanted to start off with, I read the book and it's very intriguing reading how primitive tribes, they don't really exercise. And we always had the myth, I think, that, we're kind of doing what, on our machines, what the tribesmen of Tanzania, where you talk about in other countries, are doing. And it actually turns out to be not true. And also I found out that chimpanzees don't really exercise very much at all. And that sitting also is a way of conserving energy. So if you're really attacked. And so you've been to a lot. First tell us which countries you've been to and who you've studied.
Oh gosh, well, I've been very lucky to have done fieldwork in a lot of places, but most of the research that I do is in Kenya. I've also done a fair amount of research in Mexico, but I've traveled throughout Africa and other parts of the world. But really, our focus has been mostly in East Africa.
Okay. And you also
and just back when you're talking about exercise, I think it's a good place to start is with some definitions, because we throw these words around a lot, but they actually have important meanings. So it's important to make a distinction between physical activity, which is just moving your body, right? And exercise, which is discretionary, voluntary physical activity undertaken for the sake of health and fitness. So obviously chimpanzees don't exercise, right? They don't go on a treadmill or anything like that. And for the fact of that matter is the vast majority of human beings until recently, and most human beings today, also don't exercise. Actually, about 50% of Americans don't exercise. So exercise is a very unusual form of physical activity, but it's not the same thing.
And also, exercise is a relatively new phenomenon. And you also, talk about the medicalization of exercise. That it's a prescription. Run for your life. Or you'll die. Basically, that's kind of the message. And exercise.
We have this. There's an entire, the American College of Sports Medicine has an entire trademarked division called exercise is medicine. We prescribe it as medicine, and tell people that if they don't do it, they're going to get sick, and also sell it as a kind of sometimes sold as a cure-all against disease. It is very healthy. I'm not going to argue against that, but it is not a magic bullet or a cure-all. And just telling people to exercise, it turns out, has very low effectiveness. I mean, just the adherence of most people to exercise prescriptions is depressingly low.
And the other thing is that we're told if you're depressed, exercise. If you're obese, exercise. If you have diabetes, exercise. If if you don't want to get a heart attack, exercise. And so basically, it seems to be like one of the few answers to everything. And again, but you also point out that most of the studies of exercise have been in the Western world, 98% of the studies.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, I don't want to, it's, there's a tendency to try to have the pendulum swing completely in one direction or the other. I mean, physical activity, of which exercise is one form, right, is incredibly important for reducing your vulnerability to almost every disease you can think of, right? And there are very few things you can do that are as beneficial for your health as physical activity. But it's also not a, it's not a simple prescription. It's very hard to do if you already are, if you're unfit, and it is not a magic bullet that automatically prevents you from getting sick. It's complicated, right? But I don't want to say that exercise isn't beneficial or healthy. It is, and then there are major evolutionary reasons why that's the case. But I think sometimes we oversell it and make people feel bad about the fact that they don't like to exercise and make them label them as lazy, right? And it's instinctive. You have to overcome deep ancient inhibitions to avoid unnecessary physical activity, to exercise, and we need to be sensitive to that and compassionate to that, rather than just simply assume we tell people to exercise, they'll do it, or if they don't, they're lazy. It doesn't work that way.
So where I live in Manhattan, there's gyms everywhere. When I was in Paris 20 years ago, I didn't see any gyms. I was there in August, and I started seeing a few more gyms, but I don't see as many people running. I don't see as many people, it is.
Well, remember, gyms are just one form of exercise, right? Yeah, if you walk is a form of physical activity, right? So people who walk a lot are getting quote unquote exercise. They're actually getting physical activity. So you don't need gyms. You don't need or go for a running along the Seine or the East River or Central Park to get physical activity. You need those for certain kinds of exercise in certain modern environments.
All right, so I'm going to ask some of the questions which are posed in your book. So if we are born to walk and run, why do most of us take it easy whenever possible?
Well, again, it goes back to this very basic principle, right? Which is that, human beings, like every other creature, right, are evolved to take energy in, right? And then spend it on reproduction ultimately, right? And that's the only thing that natural selection cares about, is how many offspring we have who survive and reproduce. And until recently, energy availability was very limited. And every time you spend energy on one thing, you're not spending it on something else, right? Because there are trade-offs when energy is limited, just like with time, right? The time that you're spending listening to me right now is gone, right? You'll never get it back again for anything else you do in your life, right? So it's another limited resource, time. And so when resources are limited, as they were for almost all of human evolution, and they still are for many people today on the planet, any energy you spend on something needless, like for example, this morning I ran about 7 miles, right? So I probably spent about 700 calories, right? Now, if I were on the verge of getting enough energy just to feed myself and my family, that would have been a really stupid thing to do, to waste those 700 calories getting absolutely nothing done, right? I just went for a nice run on the river here. So in circumstances where people are already very physically active, your average hunter-gatherer spends about 2.25 hours a day in moderate to vigorous physical activity, and they're just barely getting enough energy to survive and pass it on to their offspring. Unnecessary, discretionary physical activity is a terrible idea, right? And so we're selected to be physically active, much more so than chimpanzees, as you just mentioned earlier. But we're also selected not to spend excess energy. So, for me, I think that my favorite example of this is like when you go to the subway and there's an escalator next to a stairway, right? And almost everybody takes the escalator. Now, there were no escalators in the Stone Age, right? But it's still basic instinct to take the escalator because you're saving energy. Just like in my building, taking the elevator to the 5th floor, I could go on, right? So it's counterinstinctive to force yourself to take the stairway.
Right. Yeah, and people go, yeah. So I mean, I live in a walk-up, and someone says, "Well, that's good for your health." I said, "Yeah, except when I'm, lugging up, tons of groceries and stuff." But
But that's also good for you too. I mean, just think about the world. I mean, we almost never carry anything anymore, right? Our
yeah,
ancestors carried everything. They carried their babies, they carried their food, they carried their firewood, they carried their water. Now, when you want water, right, you just turn on a tap, right? Magically, it just appears, right? I mean, even in 100 or so years ago, in places like New York and London and Boston, right, people had to go to pumps and get their water every day and carry it back to their homes. So we just kind of forgotten all kinds of basic forms of physical activity, which used to be extremely common and required us to be much more active than we are today.
so I have a friend whose son was in Africa for the Peace Corps. He said one person, they walked every day 4 miles to get water and bring it
That's
to the village.
that's common. I mean, we've actually studied water carrying in the area of Kenya where we work, and how women, it's almost always women who carry the water in the area where we work, and they spend an enormous amount of energy every day carrying water, often long distances up hills. That's just, they're carrying firewood, they're carrying food, they're carrying clothing. Today, people might carry a backpack around a little bit, but that's about it. And so we live in this very, very bizarre modern world in which physical activity has mostly been removed by various forms of technology.
Okay. So should we be doing weights and cardio and high intensity training?
Well, there are benefits. I mean, the thing is that we evolved to be physically active, and in fact, that physical activity turns out to be really important because when you're physically active, you're stressing your body, right? You're stressing your cardiovascular system. You're stressing your metabolism. You're stressing your thermoregulatory system. You're stressing your bones, your muscles, and all of that stress activates repair and maintenance responses, right? Mechanisms that keep our bodies healthy. And the thing is that we never evolved not to turn on those repair and maintenance mechanisms in the absence of physical activity because, well, we never evolved to be physically inactive, right? I'll give you a very simple example that of enormous importance to us is the immune system, right? Many people today who are sedentary suffer from chronic inflammation. And it says there's very low levels of inflammation that causes heart disease, it causes diabetes, it causes a number of cancers, it causes Alzheimer's disease, it causes arthritis and osteoporosis. The list of diseases caused by inflammation is scary, right? Now, it turns out that the immune system has the ability to turn down inflammation, but the major producer of those anti-inflammatory molecules, we call them.
Okay, you're frozen. Okay. All right. Okay.
So they produce an enormous quantity. These are anti-inflammatory cytokines. We call them myokines, actually. And they actually downregulate inflammation. So it's one of the reasons why people who are physically active have much, much, much lower rates of inflammatory diseases. But we never evolved an alternative mechanism to turn down that inflammation. So physical inactivity is what we call a mismatch, an evolutionary mismatch. It's a way in which our bodies are inadequately or poorly adapted to the kinds of modern environments in which we live.
Okay, for the audience, please put your questions in the chat box. I'm sorry, in the Q&A box, not the chat box. And we'll get to them. So you also have a long paragraph on sitting. And some people.
Whole chapter, actually, yeah.
Whole chapter, yeah, more than a paragraph, whole chapter. And, I went to a lecture, sitting there, really the new smoking. And I remember once I went to a place and I couldn't get a seat. And they said, oh, well, it's better to stand. And I said, well, will you give me my seat? No. If it's so good, can I have your seat? So, so how bad is sitting for you?
Well, look, again, I think this is one of these examples.
Yeah.
This is one of these examples in which I think we undervalue just how intelligent people are, and we overfeed them for good reasons, right? I think these are well-intentioned. We exaggerate information and tell them stuff that people are pretty skeptical about. So claiming that sitting is as bad as smoking is obviously nonsense, right? Look at Queen Elizabeth, who lived to 96, right? and she probably spent much of her life sitting in very comfy chairs all over, in various palaces and whatever all over England, right? Obviously did not harm her, right? It turns out that hunter-gatherers sit as much as average Americans. They sit about 10 hours a day. Cows sit. My dog spends her day sitting all over the house. Birds sit. I mean, every animal sits. Sitting is a very sensible way not to spend excess energy. Remember, that's what we evolved to do. So claiming that all of a sudden we've invented chairs that that force people to sit more than they used to is clearly an exaggeration. It's hyperbole. Now, that said, if you spend all your day sitting at work, and then you also go home and sit all night and you never exercise, well, it's the absence of any physical activity that's problematic. And when you actually look at epidemiological data, there's actually very little association between work time sitting and chronic disease. It's leisure time sitting, which is strongly associated with negative health outcomes. And in addition, and what we also know is that it's actually what also matters is not how much you sit, but the way in which we sit. So two people can sit the same amount of time, but the person who gets up frequently is actually going to be much more likely to stay healthy than the person who sits for long, uninterrupted bouts. And that's because getting up every once in a while, which is what we evolved to do, right? To tend the fire and run after children and do all those sorts of things that we normally do from an evolutionary perspective, that kind of activates our metabolism just a little bit. It's like turning on your car engine, and that modest activation lowers glucose levels in your bloodstream, lowers fatty acid levels, triglyceride levels in your bloodstream. So really what matters is the kind of sitting, the quality of sitting, rather than the amount of sitting that you do. Of course, that is if you do some kinds of physical activity. So again, we should like tell people the truth rather than simply demonize something as simple and normal and instinctively obvious and universal as sitting.
But increasingly, more and more people have jobs that involve sitting, as opposed to 100 years ago.
That's true, but I mean, if you walk into a hunter-gatherer camp, most people are going to be sitting most of the time. When they're not out, being physically active, they're sitting. The average hunter-gatherer spends about, as I said before, about 2.25 hours a day doing moderate to vigorous physical activity. They're not like Tour de France athletes doing, huge amounts of physical activity. And much of what they do, the chores that they do, they'll do while sitting, like when they're making, tools or minding the fire or whatever, they're often sitting. So again, we've kind of exaggerated, I think, some behaviors. Sitting and sleep are the two of them that I think have gotten been treated sort of miserably by sort of modern well-intentioned efforts to get people to be more physically active. The reason I entitled the book Exercised is that we make people exercised about exercise. We make them confused and anxious and make them feel bad. And I think a better approach is to give them, a kind of broader perspective with real, with real facts.
Yeah, I mean, I have friends who say, "I didn't exercise today. It's horrible." And it's like, okay, so maybe but I don't view it that way. Sometimes you should skip a day of exercising. So you do ask that question. How do we make sense of the conflicting anxiety-inducing information about rest, physical activity, and exercise with which we are bombarded? I mean, every time I'm watching TV, there's an ad for a bike at home. There's an ad for, my insurance company pays for my gym. So I'm told, it's a great benefit, but it's like, oh, why are they doing that? I guess they want you to exercise and not, have some insurance claims.
Well, I mean, it's great that your insurance company pays for your gym, because if you are more physically active, you will cost them a lot less money. Prevention is way less expensive than treatment. And as I said before, although we sometimes oversell physical activity, let's not undersell it either, right? If you look at just average mortality, which is about the crudest measurement you can possibly have, right? Just what your chances are dying in a given year, right? People who get 150 minutes a week of moderate to vigorous physical activity, so that's what, 20 minutes a day, basically, lower their average, mortality in a given year for a given age by about 30%. That's an enormous, it's an enormous effect from a pretty small dose, right? 20 minutes a day. So, you decrease your chances of a wide range of diseases. So your insurance company is absolutely right to try to do what they can to get you to be more physically active, because it's going to save them a ton of money. The problem is that, of course, if you switch to another insurance company, if you change your job, then another insurance company is going to benefit from their investment. But that's just the way the world is.
Yeah,
Our strange medical system, or strange insurance system.
that is true. So let's talk about sleep, because you also have some chapters on sleep. So, we're told you have to get 8 hours of sleep a day. And, I had guests on where they've talked about how Benjamin Franklin and others, Jefferson, they would sleep for a couple hours, then they'd get up and read for 2 hours, and they go back to sleep. So that's a myth right there. But I don't know. I don't get 8 hours of sleep. And most people I know don't get 8 hours of sleep. And it's not because we're super busy. It's just that we just don't sleep that long. So what are some of the myths about sleep and your health and also your mental well-being? If you don't sleep, your mental well-being goes.
Well, I mean, yeah. So the first few chapters of the book, I dealt with sleep and sitting and just sort of resting metabolism, because if you want to understand physical activity, you have to understand physical inactivity. And I think we have a really, we make people exercised about sleep and sitting, just as like we make people exercised about other forms of exercise. So the idea that for some reason you need 8 hours of sleep was just kind of made up, right? It turns out that if you even look at the data, large-scale epidemiological studies, people who sleep 8 hours actually have higher mortality rates on average than people who sleep 7 hours. Now, I don't want to trivialize lack of sleep. If you're really truly short of sleep, you do pay a very serious price. But there's a lot of variation for what people need, and of course, it varies between individuals. It varies over age. But there's a kind of it's often been called the sleep industrial complex, a whole industry that's evolved around making people feel stressed about how much sleep they get, and then selling them various kinds of products to help them sleep. And of course, the one way to ensure that somebody doesn't get much sleep is to make them stressed about it, because stress, psychosocial stress, elevates cortisol. Cortisol is an arousal hormone, which, guess what, prevents you from sleeping. So we get people to buy all kinds of crazy mattresses and pillows and things you can stick on your nose. And of course, the worst are hypnotic medications, which have terrible relationship to long-term health. While we should be concerned about people who really are truly sleep deprived, we should also just back off some of these overly medicalized prescriptions about sleep, because they're actually counterproductive. And so a good example of this kind of information is if you go to hunter-gatherer tribes, go to parts of the world where people don't have electricity. There's no TVs, there's no light bulbs, there's no cell phones, there's no alarm clocks, and you actually measure how much they sleep normally. They get about 6 to 7 hours. They're not sleeping 8 hours. And for the most part, by the way, they don't wake up in the middle of the night. So this idea of first sleep and second sleep comes mostly from historical texts. There's very little evidence of this in sleep studies around people around the world. We just make all kinds of stuff up, and it doesn't really benefit almost anyone.
So the pills like Ambien and Lunesta, there was someone once put on Twitter said, "Every time I take Lunesta, I'm up all night thinking how much money this pill cost me."
Well, actually, what's amazing about those pills also, if you actually look at randomized control studies where they give them the pill or give somebody a placebo, the pill actually, most of these medications actually have very little effect. But even more scary is that they come with quite a price, right? And there's a serious increased risk of of decreased longevity from many of these pills, where we treat sleep in a really brutal way.
Well, I know that they relax the throat muscles, which is a risk factor for sleep apnea.
Sure, but there's other, well, it depends on the kind of hypnotic. There are different kinds that have different effects, right? But the really important point is that people who take them have shorter lifespans. And there's study after study after study have shown that. And a lot of people don't realize that or know that. What the problem is that what we're doing is we're often treating the symptom of the problem rather than the cause. The real reason that most people don't get enough sleep is because they're stressed. Stress prevents sleep, right? And instead of dealing with the stresses, caused by lawyers and, the news and who knows what the various issues are, right? Instead, we're treating the symptom with medications and so on. And that's never a sensible strategy, right? We pay a price for that.
No, I mean, when I had young children, I was sleep deprived.
Of course, and it's normal. Because after all, what natural selection cares about is not whether you're happy or healthy or whatever. All it cares about is how many children you have who survive and reproduce. So you don't have children to benefit your health. You have children to benefit your reproductive success.
Right. Yeah. So let me go to some of the questions from the audience, and I'm going to read them. And so let's see what we got here. I have always exercised, walked, no car, swam, did yoga, Pilates, have a healthy diet, and have no health problems. Plus, I have kept a steady 60 kilograms at 1.65 meters. I'm now a senior, work freelance globally, and have no plans to slow down. Question: do you think that my good health is related to my exercise and lifestyle? Plus, why do so many people my age put on weight and say it's part of aging? I don't believe that you need to put on weight as you age, as people have become lazy and sit and drive everywhere. What do you think?
Okay, well,
There's
a lot of stuff in this question. All right.
Yes.
First of all is that, staying physically active does reduce your risk from many, if not most, health problems. So sure, the chances are that your physical activity has had some effect on your health is very high. It's probably almost surely the case. And remember, what physical activity does actually is it increases what we call your health span, the period of your life in which you're healthy. And until recently, health span equaled lifespan, because prior to modern medical care, your health span was your lifespan. And it turns out that if you actually look at the heritability of the genetic effects of on lifespan, turns out that there's very little evidence for genes that have much of an effect under the age of 80. Once you get over the age of 80, then the heritability of longevity goes way up, right? So there seem to be some genes that are still yet to be identified that help people live, to be, as old as Queen Elizabeth, for example. But and we also know that by far the vast majority of the variance in people's health outcomes doesn't come from genes, doesn't come from medicine, which actually has a very tiny effect. It's mostly your environment, right? It's either the social aspects of your environment or the behavioral and other aspects of your environment, such as diet and exercise. So yeah, that just makes total sense. Now, to the second part of the question about weight, it is normal for people to actually add a little bit of weight as they age. For example, estrogen, for example, in women, when estrogen levels decline, many women notice that there's an association between those lower levels of estrogen and how their fat deposition changes, for example. So there are aging effects on weight. And it's been shown that as people get older, a little extra stored energy in the form of fat actually can have some beneficial effects. So that's kind of completely normal. But yeah, I do worry about about labeling people as lazy, though. That's again, that's one of the things that I really have, my research has really caused me to kind of rethink.
What is happening physiologically when you experience a second wind during exercise?
Oh, that's a kind of, I'm not, I think there's more than one phenomena going on there, but that's usually, um, your, you know, your, your hormones kicking in, right? There's a number of factors there. I mean, one is energy release, but the other is, the various kinds of opioids and endogenous opioids, and sometimes even endocannabinoids and whatever that, and glucagon, which is a hormone that releases energy. So that's happening when you exercise. Sometimes you're kind of energy depleted of them, and then these physiological systems start to kick in. The mind also does complicated things too. So perceived exertion can be a complex thing. So there's probably a number of different factors that contribute to that sort of second wind phenomenon. Not to mention the third and the fourth wind.
Yeah. I mean, having seen a lot of long tennis matches, you see a person looks exhausted, and all of a sudden he starts winning, and then he doesn't
right.
seem tired anymore.
The mind is very, very powerful.
Things hurt a lot more when you're losing. So are there differences on the individual levels that dictate what exercises are good or effective for you?
Well, this is kind of classic medicalized sort of kind of exercise question, right? People want to know, what's the right prescription, right? What's the dose that they should take and what kind, right? And there's no simple answer to this. And it's what's going to be good for one individual is not going to be the same as for another individual, depending upon your age and your fitness level and what kinds of previous health conditions you have. So coming up with a one size fits all prescription is absolutely impossible. I think what we can say is that for almost everybody on the planet, some physical activity is better than none, and that as you increase, you get more benefit, but the benefits are marginal, and then at some point they kind of tail off, right? And there's really you don't need to running marathons is no healthier than running, half marathons or even 10K races or whatever. It's not really, you're not getting that much of an extra benefit from the marathon. But we also do know that there's no question that as also, particularly as people age, that mixing it up is also important, right? So one of the major challenges that people get as they age is a condition called sarcopenia. So that's basically Greek for flesh loss. Sarco is flesh and penia is loss, and it's the kind of muscle wasting that occurs as people age, and that is actually a really serious problem, because as people age and become more frail, they lose functional capacity. As they lose functional capacity, they're less physically active, which sets in motion a vicious cycle, right? So as you age, it's really important to not only continue doing aerobic, AKA cardio exercise, but really, really, really important to continue to do some strength training. It has enormous effects on your lifelong health and ability to function well as you age. So, some is better than none. Mix it up, and don't ever stop, because as we age, physical activity becomes actually, I think, the biggest myth of exercise of all is that it's normal to be less active as we age. And as we age, the benefits of physical activity go up, not down. They have even larger effects as we get older.
So can you comment about the 10,000 step fad?
We have actually a paper and press on this, actually. So yeah, 10,000 steps. That was actually so before the 1960 Olympics in Tokyo, no, 1964 Olympics, I guess it was, in Tokyo, a Japanese company invented the first commercial pedometer, and they decided to call it, the Japanese term for it was manpoke, which means 10,000 steps, and it's a kind of auspicious number, and they thought it was just good for marketing purposes. They just pulled it out of a hat, basically. They said that sounds about right, and it's an auspicious number. Turns out, it's not, again, a simple prescription, but turns out it's not that far off from a reasonable a number of steps today to take. And there are lots of studies, and of course they vary depending upon age and sex, etc. But up to about 7,000 steps a day at least, there are definite health benefits. Above 7,000 steps, you can argue. Again, these are big epidemiological studies. Everybody's different. But certainly taking, look, walking is the most fundamental form of physical activity that we evolved to do, right? It's what we are all about as a species in many ways. It's not the only form of physical activity. It's occasionally useful to do something vigorous like run or whatever, but walking is fundamental, and an adequate amount of walking on a daily basis is a terrific way to improve your health, not to mention both physical and mental health.
So here's, I'm just going to read the questions that come in. Well, it's counterintuitive to take the stairway. Isn't it also counterintuitive biologically to have so much carbohydrates and surplus calorie availability?
Well, okay, so one is counterinstinctive and the other is just abnormal, right? So it is counterinstinctive to exercise, to do unnecessary physical activity. It is not counterinstinctive to eat as much as you can when you can, because in conditions of food shortage, people scarf down whatever they can, right? I've gone, foraging with hunter-gatherers, and my God, I've never seen people eat that much honey in my life. I mean, they'll just eat as much as they possibly can, to the point that I would get sick if I ate that much honey. But they don't get it that much honey. That's the only sweet thing they get in their entire lives. There's no candy for them. There's no, there's no cookies. There's no cake. Honey's it, right? So that's not counterintuitive. But they live in environments where those sorts of foods are limited, and so they just don't have the opportunity to eat as much as we do. But and again, I remember that we didn't not evolve to be healthy. We evolved to have as many offspring as possible. So and so from a simple evolutionary perspective, getting as much energy as you can is always a good idea. Well, always used to be a good idea, because after all, the basic equation of life is, food in and babies out. More food in means more babies, right? And we now live in this very, very, very unusual circumstance where we have more food than we can eat, and we have to now do something extremely counterinstinctive, which is to try to limit our intake of food. So
I've done a lot of writing about risk adversity and risk profiles. And birds, if they see food, they'll go for it. They're not going to say, maybe I'll find something better.
Of course, every animal does. Yeah.
So I have a question. What about yoga in terms of an ancient tradition of exercise that humans involved?
I mean, yoga is not that ancient. I mean, yoga is, from my perspective, it's a flash in the pan, right? It's a blink of an eye. This is like yoga. These are traditions that all come after the origins of agriculture. These are all actually, quite recent. Look, there are many, many forms of physical activity that different cultures have invented. Yoga is one of them, and most of them are wonderful. There's nothing, but let's not pretend that yoga is anything other than a recent invention. But is it healthy and wonderful? Of course it is. But it's nothing. There's nothing special about yoga as opposed to, some other forms of physical activity.
Can physical exercise reduce a person's vulnerability to dementia? And if so, how?
Absolutely. In fact, that's a great question, and it's an important question. Nothing, I'm going to say this, I know I sound like a broken record, but nothing comes even remotely as close to reducing your risk of forms of dementia such as Alzheimer's as physical activity. It is maybe an order of magnitude have more effect than anything ever discovered. And there are probably a number of reasons for it. So one of them, so the number of mechanisms that are activated by physical activity. Probably one of the most important is that physical activity, your muscles actually produce something called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic growth factor. It's actually what stimulates new neurons to grow in your brain. It also stimulates repair of astrocytes and probably cuts down on inflammation, because Alzheimer's, for example, turns out to be it's basically an inflammatory disease in the brain. But there are other factors as well: insulin, increased blood flow, lower, there's probably a whole series of mechanisms that turn on as a result of physical activity that reduce risks of Alzheimer's. So I'm not sure if I'm going to get the fact exactly right, but again, about people who exercise about 150 minutes a week have approximately a 30 to 40% lower lifetime risk of Alzheimer's. And there's a dose response effect, so that the more exercise you do, the lower your risk is. So, if you're worried about Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia, you could do, Sudoku or some, whatever, try to do various, mental games or eat turmeric or whatever. None of them come remotely as close as to exercise, and for reasons that we actually understand to a certain degree.
So I have a lot of friends who are taking metformin because metformin fights inflammation. They're taking it for Alzheimer's, they're taking it for diabetes, they're taking it for heart. It's being studied. Where's it being studied?
Being studied all over the place. Metformin is the it drug at the moment. It's one of the it drugs.
Right.
It's metformin is a complicated drug, but basically it's it's associated with it's basically an insulin. It affects the insulin pathway, and there are arguments that it extends lifespan. I have to say that it's certainly an important drug for metabolic syndrome, and so it's primarily prescribed for diabetes. I am not a physician, so I'm not going to comment strongly on its other effects on other diseases, but you can choose between taking a pill that has some side effects and whose effects may wear off, and I'm not sure how effective it is for many of these things, versus the real thing. And the real thing is exercise, physical activity. So,
well, metformin does have valid uses for people with diabetes, though.
Of course it does. Yeah, no, and wouldn't argue that you shouldn't take metformin, especially if you have diabetes. But people are beginning to think about it as an alternative to essentially lifestyle, as a way to extend life and or in health. I'm not convinced about that. That's such a good idea.
So here's a question: what is Dr. Lieberman's exercise regimen, and have you always exercised at that level?
Well, look, my exercise levels is really neither here nor there, right? That's what I do. But I put it this way: I don't want to be a hypocrite. So when I go to the office every day, my office is on the 5th floor of the Peabody Museum at Harvard, which is a big, beautiful old building. And I would, every single day I walk into the building, I want to take the elevator. But if anybody sees me on the elevator, I'll be called a hypocrite. So it forces me to take the stairs. So,
Okay.
So it's not that I don't want to take the elevator, but I'm kind of coerced by my research to take the stairs. But seriously, no, I do like to exercise. I'm mostly a runner. And I run a fair amount, and I try to do, strength training on a regular basis. Like every morning when I'm making the coffee for my wife and me, I do push-ups. It seems like a kind of habit I've developed. So I like to walk a lot, bike a reasonable amount. So I try to stay physically active because not only because I want to practice what I preach, but also because it helps me, keeps me sane. Both the mental health issues effects are as strong, if not as stronger than the physical benefits.
Okay. Here's a question: exercising classes with others is a good, besides exercise, it's a good social activity, which is good for health. Have you covered the social benefits of exercising with others in your book, especially?
Well, there's a whole section. There's a whole few chapters on this. Absolutely. Look.
I know that, but she's asked.
So the argument of the book is that we evolved to be physically active for 2 reasons and 2 reasons only, right? One is when it was necessary, and the second reason is when it's rewarding, right? And what makes things rewarding? Well, being social. So, one of the most common forms of physical activity that's social and rewarding is dancing, right? Every culture on the planet has dancing. And people don't think of dancing as exercise, but people will dance for hours and hours in most cultures around the world, right? And if we want to get people more physically active, I think that one of the best way, if not the best way, is to make it more social. So, you know, I run with friends, right? We have a running group, and I have friends, and we chat while we run. In fact, I'm meeting another professor tomorrow morning at 7:15 on the corner between our houses, and we'll probably chat about, I don't know, how much we hate the deans or whatever. But yeah, it's social, and that it doesn't feel like a run. It feels like I'm meeting a friend. And the same is true for, you know, for walking with friends, or playing a game of football or soccer, or, you know, whatever it is you like to do. You know, the more we make it social, the more it's less like a kind of form of drudgery, and the more it's something that's rewarding. And furthermore, when you do things socially, you help each other, right? You get through those lows, and you have what we call a commitment contract, right? So, like the fact that I'm agreeing to meet my friend tomorrow morning, I better be out there, right? Otherwise, my friend will be really irritated at me, and vice versa. And you know, it feels like a great idea right now, but at 7:15 tomorrow morning, it might not feel like such a great idea. So there are many, many, many benefits to making physical activity social. And I think that if we seriously, as a culture and as individuals, want to make it, you know, people enjoy it, and help them overcome those natural inclinations, nothing will be more effective than making it social.
So are there any supplements or lifestyle diet changes that show promise? Sirtuin activators such as metformin, calorie restriction, vancomycin, things like that.
Basically, no.
Okay.
I mean, you know, everybody, you know, all the time, people are coming up constantly with some latest, you know, pill that's supposed to have some magical miracle effects, and they all come short, all of them. And my null hypothesis is that none of these things are going to have much of an effect. So just like let's take calorie restriction, right? The evidence for calorie restriction having any benefits for humans is basically zilch, despite there's, you know, it helps worms and it helps rodents, but the evidence for helping primates. So there was one study that was done in Wisconsin where they gave primates a calorie restricted diet, but they compared them to monkeys that were overfed and were getting diabetes. So guess what? The underfed monkeys did better than the ones who were being overfed and getting sick from metabolic syndrome. When the experiment was repeated at vast expense by the National Institutes of Health, where they actually had monkeys on a normal diet and then a calorie restricted set of monkeys, there was no benefit whatsoever for those monkeys. And I could go on, right? So calorie restriction has turned out to be a complete lack of evidence for that. Intermittent fasting is the latest, you know, fad. But if you look at the data, there's really very little promising evidence that intermittent fasting has really any substantial effects. And I could go on. The fact of the matter is that basic healthy lifestyle is the only thing that we really know as being effective for prevention. You know, don't smoke, get enough sleep, but don't worry about 8 hours. You know, don't eat crap, and stay physically active. That's pretty much it. And you do those things, and you lower your vulnerability to a wide range of diseases by an awful lot.
So the Framingham heart studies started when they looked at American soldiers who died in combat, and they had, you know, their hearts were like, 18-year-old men had the hearts of a 60-year-old guy, full of cholesterol, all these kinds of things. The people who were prisoners of war, you know, who were eating, if they were lucky, worms or, you know, anything else, their hearts were kind of clear. So there's always been that argument for diet, like, you know, like, so, okay, how about this? Are vegans healthier than meat eaters? Are vegetarians healthier than meat eaters?
Well, first of all, we're now going into another class that I teach on diet. So these are complicated topics. Diet, of course, is incredibly important. The link between saturated fat and heart disease is also very controversial, partly because when you do studies on what people eat, and you basically look at the absence or more of this or more of one substance, you have to also correct for what they're not, what they're eating in return. So, for example, if you eat less fat, you end up eating maybe more sugar or more carbohydrate. So these, and our bodies are able to turn simple sugars and simple carbohydrates into fat just as readily as we can digest fat. So it's complicated, right? So there's no question that diet has enormous effects on health, just like physical activity. It's not an either or, it's a both. I mean, heart disease is a good example of one. Certainly, diets that promote obesity increase cardiovascular disease. There's no question about that.
So someone wrote, I never slept more than 4 hours a night. Now I'm dealing with a husband with dementia. I'm not getting 2 hours. How is this detrimental?
2 hours a night?
Yeah.
Well, look, I mean,
It's not a good diet. It's not
the chances are, I mean, the reason 2 hours a night, I mean, there's a number of reasons why sleep is important. I mean, one of them is that lack of sleep elevates stress, which of course then decreases your ability to sleep. So it becomes a vicious circle, and stress is pernicious. But sleep is also important because it's important for repair of the brain while we're sleeping. Our brain essentially washes itself out, for lack of a better term. So it gets rid of metabolites and other waste products, and your brain functions better when you sleep. Your sleep is also important for memory consolidation and cognitive function. So there's a whole litany of things that are important. There's a reason we have to sleep. Sleep has a number of important biological functions. And so when you overly deprive yourself of sleep, you know, you build up damage, you know. So it's I'm sorry to hear about that condition, but you know, sometimes we don't get a choice how much sleep we get, but it's something to pay attention to.
Okay, so someone wrote about interval training. I've seen a lot of claims that interval training is a superior form of exercise because of the high intensity bouts. Is there anything inherently superior about it?
Well, see, again, this is one of those ways in which it's the medicalization of exercise, right? There's always something du jour, right? So there is no question that interval training is great, right? So occasionally doing some vigorous physical activity has big benefits. But I don't know anybody who is completely fit from only doing interval training, right? That's just silly, right? Obviously, you know, mixing it up is important. So you get benefit from walking and doing low intensity or moderate intensity aerobic physical activity. Interval training has other benefits. Strength training has yet other benefits. Again, it's this idea of like there's one form of exercise and that's all. I just take one pill and that's all I have to do. Is just not the way it works. Interval training is a wonderful component to the way in which people do exercise, and that is a whole section and chapter in the book on speed and interval training. But it in and of itself is not the only kind of physical activity that any sensible person would prescribe. You know, mix it up. Okay.
So what can people who are overweight, obese do about incorporating exercise?
Ooh, great question. That's a really good question. So
asked by a friend of mine from high school. So yeah.
So first of all, let's just dispense with one myth. You can read now various people who claim that you can't lose weight through exercising, and that really gets me concerned because that's actually not true. It's that it's hard to lose a lot of weight rapidly through exercising because exercise just doesn't burn that many calories relative to dieting. And there are sometimes some compensatory mechanisms, but also the people who tend to be overweight or obese and start an exercise regime tend to be relatively unfit, and they can't do that much exercise, and so the doses that they do tend not to be that very high. So again, the standard dose that's recommended by many physicians, the World Health Organization, the American Heart Association, et cetera, is 150 minutes a week, which again is 20 minutes a day. You know, that's like 50 calories a day of exercise. You're not going to lose a lot of weight by exercising 50 calories a day, right? So you really have to double that to begin to see effects. And again, it's going to be slow and steady and very, very incremental. That said, though, there are some benefits. There are some really important benefits to making exercise a component of a weight loss regime. And the most important, in addition to all the other health benefits you get from exercise in terms of your cardiovascular health and hypertension and Alzheimer's and metabolic health and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, is that it also is a really important tool for preventing weight gain and weight regain. So with most diets, people quickly lose a few pounds on a diet, and then they come rushing back. But people who exercise when they diet are much less likely to get that weight regain. So exercise is really important for preventing a weight regain during a diet. So it's important component of pretty much any weight loss regime. And don't expect huge amounts. And then finally, I think a part of your point of your question is that if somebody is seriously has a lot of extra weight, right, and tries to exercise, say the same amount as somebody who's thin and fit, it's basically like carrying around weights, right? You're basically doubling the amount. You can, like, if you're twice as much weight, you're basically having to do twice as much work, right, in order to exertion, in order to do the same amount of exercise, which is usually measured in time, right? So it's harder to exercise when you're overweight. And a third component of that is that people who are unfit and overweight tend to get less of a sort of neurotransmitter benefit. So one of the main neurotransmitters that's upregulated during physical activity, during exercise, is dopamine, which is a reward hormone, right? It makes you feel like to do it again, right? But people who are overweight, especially obese, have insensitivity to dopamine, and they don't get the same reward, which is really, I think, extremely unfair, right? So it takes longer for people who are unfit and overweight to get to the same kind of point where they actually begin to enjoy it. So it's a really challenging. It's really challenging for people who are to kind of exercise to lose weight and to exercise when they're unfit and overweight.
Well, it's also hard to go to a gym where there's, to go to like a yoga Pilates class, or if you're overweight, because everyone there is in their, these.
Yeah, I mean, and the
Yeah.
exactly, and the stigmatization of people who are struggling with their weight is really unfortunately common, and though I think it's unacceptable. And so yes, that's also another challenge. I completely agree. But it's again, it's one of the reasons why we need to be more compassionate rather than judgmental. It's why I think, again, we need to be less exercised about exercise. And I think dispelling some of these myths and giving people solid, useful information is profoundly what we need.
The other thing I want to point out is that I have a cousin who died of early onset Alzheimer's. He was in great shape. He exercised all the time. He was a tennis player. He was a champion. He was a college player.
Right.
Semi-pro. You can still get Alzheimer's. Exercise doesn't.
Sure. Well, early onset Alzheimer's is basically a different disease than the late onset. So it has a different etiology, has a different set of causes. And you're right, exercise is not going to prevent that. And I'm not claiming that exercise can prevent all Alzheimer's. It isn't going to, but it decreases your vulnerability, especially for the late onset, the kind of Alzheimer's that is much, much more common. People who exercise are much less likely to get Alzheimer's.
But they can,
full stop.
But they can still get it.
Of course, they can still get it. As I said, I've said many times in this discussion, we oversell exercise as a magic bullet, and I'm not trying to suggest it is. It reduces your vulnerability. It's not a pure prevention. Nothing is. I wish it were that case, but it isn't. I mean, breast cancer is another example. Women who exercise, get 150 minutes a week, lower their lifetime risk of breast cancer substantially, 30 to 50% by most estimates. Does it mean that you'll never get breast cancer? No. But is there anything else that's ever become close to physical activity to reducing your risk of breast cancer? No. So, it should be part of our armamentarium. It's not the sole thing to do, but it is one of those things over which we have some degree of control and has enormous effects. But again, let's not pretend that it's easy to do or normal, and that if you struggle to do it, there's something wrong with you. That's also not true.
It's also getting screenings, also mammograms and those are
Sure, it's not, yeah, I'm not saying exercise is the only thing. I would never say that.
okay. And so my last question is, does low-level exercise, e.g. moderate walking, preferentially burn fat over high-intensity exercise?
Oh, the old fat burning zone. Yeah. So I should probably explain the physiology behind this. So when you're using energy that you've stored in your body to do physical activity, you at low levels, like right now, I'm just sitting gesticulating, right? So I'm not really doing any serious physical activity. At very low levels of physical activity, the body primarily burns fat. And as you start walking, you're burning mostly fat. As you speed up, you start burning more carbohydrate. And when you're at a full sprint, you're burning only carbohydrate. You're not burning any fat. So this led some companies, mostly treadmill companies, to put on their treadmills at low speeds that it was the fat burning zone. And it's true that at low speeds, you're primarily burning fat and you're not burning carbohydrate. And we store carbohydrate in the form of glycogen in our bodies. So that's true to a certain extent. But when you're also at a slow speed, you're also using less energy. So it turns out that when you go faster, you are burning a higher percentage of carbohydrate, but you're also burning more energy overall, which means you're also burning more fat. So I wouldn't worry about this stuff at all.
Okay, well, I want to thank you, Dr. Lieberman, for spending some time with us. And why don't you show your book again and tell people where they can get it?
I feel like I'm shilling it in the street here.
You are,
Exercise.
yes.
It's now in paperback, it's in Kindle, it's in everything you can get in quite a few languages too. So hope you enjoy it.
All right, well, thank you so much. I hope you come back one day and talk about some of the other research.
Sure. All right.
That'll be great. Okay, thanks everyone. We'll be back October 20th, hopefully sooner, but we're going to actually be discussing oxytocin. So thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Lieberman, and the audience. Thank you very much for all your great questions. It makes my job a lot easier. And it's a really good book. It's a lot of fun to read, and you'll learn a lot of things about different cultures, which you're not going to learn anywhere else. So again, thank you, everyone. Stay safe and happy fall. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.